Good morning. It is 9 a.m. Welcome to the March 21st, 2018 City Council meeting. Let the record reflect that all City Council members and officials are present. Please stand for the invocation first and then a pledge of allegiance.
Our gracious and heavenly Father, first we thank you for the privilege of living in a country where we enjoy the many freedoms provided by our founding fathers in their wisdom, the freedom in their assembly, and to assemble and to speak our minds without fear and retribution. We also wish to invoke your special blessings on the results of our work in this council. The success we have made are all with your help and guidance. We should not forget to ask your continued blessings and guidance for those city employees who have contributed so much of their talents and personal commitments to the improvement of our city. All these things we pray in your name. Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of
America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, John.
You're welcome.
Next, we just have one special presentation by our lobbyist, Jerry Paul, a recap of the 2018 Florida legislative session.
Well, thank you, Mayor, Councilman, and Councilwoman, and Mr. Koenig. I think I spoke with each of you a little bit earlier today, and I've been in communication with each of you throughout this legislative process, and it was wonderful to host the mayor and Councilman Cummings in Tallahassee during the legislative session this year. They can tell you more about that trip. Maybe they gave you an after-action report already. Maybe they even shared some photos. I've got a few you'd like to see. Maybe they didn't show you, but it all went. That part of it all went well. To summarize quickly, let me just give you an overview of what's been happening in the Capitol, the political dynamics that have governed the climate there, and then what I think we're looking at going forward. First of all, as you know, it's an annual 60-day legislative session. We ended up extending 3 extra days in order to get a budget deal between the House and the Senate, which has now gone on to the governor, and he's already signed it. The session began by being largely dominated. You know, typically each year there's some major issue that casts the environment or the climate of the session going forward. This year at the beginning it was Hurricane Irma, just coming off of that, and the recognition that Florida had a big bill to pay, of course, and a lot of activities involved policy-wise as well to become increasingly prepared for natural disasters. The South Florida, the Keys, and Southwest Florida got hit the hardest, and so everything was kind of governed by that. Within, I would say, 3 or 4, 2.5, 3 weeks of the session, there appeared to be a bit of what we called Irma amnesia. Some of the members outside South Florida tended to forget the priority of that, and we all were kind of fighting to get the funding back in for that initiative. And right about that time is when the Parkland issue hit, and then that really took over and dominated not just the politics, as you have read about, but also the appropriations. So the budget was very tight going into this session. Irma then required a huge drain of funds in order to recover from that. And then on top of that, almost $500 million that had to be teased out of the budget additionally for school safety in the wake of Parkland. On top of that, no small factor, this is an election year, and so there are a non-trivial number of members of the legislature who are focused very much on re-election, including the presiding, at least one of the presiding officers, which can have a pretty significant impact upon the priorities for things like funding as well as policy. Other issues that tended to dominate the policy side, most germane to us would be, for example, the preemption issues and a host of bills that have continued to move through the session, through the legislature, typically dying towards the end, but that would preempt more decision-making authority from the local government up to the state government. So much so that it appeared and and still does appear to be a bit of a trend. There is no one single bill that says we're going to do away with home rule authority, or there's no bill that says that the legislature and the state are going to preempt powers of the local governments. But on an issue-by-issue basis, there are examples of that. And most all of them, when you really reach behind the curtain, what you find is that they result from some anecdotal scenario that was actually legitimate and requires action in one specific community, but then at times there's a bit of an overreaction and a bill gets filed to make it state policy. A good example would be the CRA bills that have moved through the legislative process 2 or 3 years in a row. You have a couple of community redevelopment agencies out of over 400. You have 1 or 2 of them in the lower East Coast. And by the way, almost all of these issues, I'm going to get in trouble here, but almost all of them emerge from Miami, right? Or somewhere in the lower East Coast, right? So there's a CRA in the lower East Coast where indeed there were, leaders of that CRA who were maybe making decisions about spending money that weren't directly related to the initial core mission of the CRA, and there was a lack of fiscal accounting and so on. And there was a series of audits showing that there weren't financial accounting processes in place. And it became a political firestorm, and that largely gave rise to a bill a couple of years ago to just have no more CRAs and to significantly clamp down on existing CRAs and phase them out, and a whole host of proposals like that. We've been able to kill that bill 2 years in a row, and again this year it died as well. So, but that's a good example. So there are a whole host of those bills. There was one this year related to decisions about tree trimming. Well, the story kind of writes itself. You can imagine that was based upon some anecdotal scenario in some municipality or county where some legislator was upset about presumably tree trimming, and so a statewide bill gets filed to preempt decisions about tree trimming. Again, that bill died, and essentially all of those preemption bills we ultimately are able to hold back. But it does take a lot of time and energy and resources, and it certainly heightens our awareness and our attention to the relationship between local government and state government. So those are the issues that generally have permeated throughout the legislative session. For us, I would say more specifically, the CRA bill for one in policy space, the vacation rental bill, and by the way, some of the preemption bills do emanate from the way that our economy is changing itself. And as this shared economy with disruptive technologies and disruptive business models like Uber and like Airbnb and so on and so forth have naturally brought about an analysis of this nexus between local government and state government, because there is an interest on the state level in not having a patchwork of regulations that are very difficult for the marketplace to figure out. So take, for example, Uber not being able to operate or procure an Uber ride in one municipality, but 2 blocks over you can. That becomes confusing, particularly to a tourist marketplace. So some of the preemption issues emanate from that. As you know, last year we passed an Uber bill that essentially meted out a compromise between local governments, which draw revenue off of the taxi cabs, and Uber, which was caused to agree to certain levels of regulations, but obviously the result of that is a disruption in the marketplace and a disruption in the power and authority between local government and state government because they wanted to have a uniform system. So too, in that vein, vacation rentals and the perception that there was an emerging patchwork of regulations related to, whether and where and the extent to which you can alienate your own property. So it's bound up in a property rights issue, but at the same time, concerns about operating a private residence essentially like a hotel. And so that's an interesting intellectual debate. It worked its way through the legislative session, came closer to passing last year than this year, but again, ultimately that bill did not pass. By the way, one of the provisions that we sought as a fallback in that bill was a grandfathering provision for pre-2011. So any local governments that had ordinances in place related to vacation rentals would have been exempted from that bill, but we ended up defeating the bill overall. On the appropriations front, the good news is that there was an increase in funding for transportation, $5.6 billion, which helps our local governments. There was a marginal increase in funding on a per-student basis in public education. On the local project issue front, pretty thin this year. It was thin going into this cycle, even though our revenues for the state were looking fairly good entering the quarter of the session. The encumbered recurring expenses from past commitments were already projected to gobble up most of that, and that was pre-Irma. And then Irma, they had to tease a lot of money out for Irma, and then the Parkland was another almost $500 million. So local projects were not looking very favorable to start with. And then, although our project for Boca Grande neighborhood, we did have in the budget initially on the House side, and we can thank Representative Ben Albritton, a friend of all of ours who was chairing that appropriations subcommittee, who got us into the budget for that, and also our local state representative, Mike Grant, who was very instrumental in that. Unfortunately, however, when that budget then went up the chain to the fourth floor, as they say, the speaker, it, along with most local projects, disappeared, and those funds got redistributed in some nonlinear ways, let's say. And so we fought really hard to try to get that funding back in. Essentially, the way that the local project funds, particularly for water projects, ended up being distributed were more on a larger community basis. So a lot of the local projects for municipalities got collapsed into one or two projects for an entire county or for a regional entity. Now, of course, the city of Punta Gorda supported all of Charlotte County's proposals, and we did fairly well on that. $500,000 for septic to sewer for El Jabin, and I think the speaker saw that as a county-wide issue, and so he could kind of check the box for everybody in Charlotte with that, which is fine. We also were able to get some funds for the firefighter training facility here in Punta Gorda, $1.5 million for that. Peace River Water Supply Authority received $1 million for the expansion and improvement of the aquifer storage and recovery, which helps everybody in this county, Manatee, Sarasota, and DeSoto as well. But as to our funding, we don't have a direct appropriation for Boca Grande. What we were able to do, I think, is leverage some good momentum on that for the grant side. And as you know, we have two grants before DEP, a TMDL grant with a 50-50 match, and then one grant, the so-called 319F grant. Both of those are in process, and Representative, soon-to-be Senator Albritton has pledged that in the wake of the speaker taking our funding from the appropriations side, he's pledged to assist with those grants on the agency side. As I mentioned, Representative slash soon-to-be Senator Albritton and Representative Grant, let me pause for a moment and talk a little bit about the politics in our area. There's been quite a bit of musical chairs. Some of you have read a bit about this, but Congressman Rooney has decided to not seek re-election, and that, of course, has caused two members of the legislature, one of whom in our delegation, Senator Greg Stubbe, to leave his Senate seat and run for that. Also, Representative Julio Gonzalez, whose district comes down into Inglewood, he's running for that seat as well. So that's a vacant Senate seat, a vacant House seat. The likely successors to those are on the Senate side, Representative Joe Gruters, who is currently a representative in the Sarasota County area, and he currently doesn't have major opposition. He will likely win that seat, if or when he does, or anybody else, of course, will get the new senator down here to meet the council and establish that relationship as well. I think Representative Gruters would be very effective for our area. Also, a little bit to the east of that, as you know, one of the members of our delegation, Senator Denise Grimsley, she's running for statewide office, and so her seat's vacant, and our good friend, Representative Albritton, is running for that seat, and he's currently unopposed. And as you know, he is a very strong champion of Punta Gorda, and that would be very, very favorable for us on the Senate side. In the House side, we're very well represented by Representative Grant. He knows our area. He knows Punta Gorda. He's hardworking, loyal. This is his second time in the legislature, so he understands the process, and so I think we're well served by that. As a general rule, the Southwest Florida delegation is losing a lot off of our bench, and if you, with the exception of the new Senate president coming in, Senator Bill Galvano, most of the districts south of him, all the way down to Collier County until you get to Senator Pasadomo, are going to be fairly new members. For our area, though, because we have Representative Grant, who has some experience, and presumably Representative Albritton as our new senator, one of our new senators, and Gruters, I think this pocket right here is going to be very well served, but right outside of us, it's going to be pretty green. But that's okay. We'll do fine. And speaking of which, we'll do fine, as in we. As you know, in the CRC, there's this proposal that would ban local governments from retaining me. which is fine. But let me pause for a moment about the Constitutional Revision Commission, and I'll take some questions. So, as most of you know, Florida is unique in America. We're the only state that has a periodic, once every 20-year process, essentially a mini constitutional convention, where everything in our Constitution gets laid on the table and is up for review, for deletions, for amendments, and for new proposals. The Constitutional Revision Commission is 37 members appointed by the governor, the Speaker of the House, and the President of the Senate. And they began meeting about a year ago, April of last year, and they have gone around the state twice now, meeting in pretty much every area of the state within a 1 to 2 hour driving distance, trying to get input, ideas from the public on what should be changed in our state constitution. They then went back, they got over 1,400 submissions, proposals. Ultimately, there were 103 actual filed amendments by CRC commissioners. That's now been reduced down to 37. And over the last 3 days, they've gone into a floor session where they are actually voting on those to determine whether they go on to further committee stops. It's down to, I think, 26 now that are still alive, and of those 26, about half of them have gotten a majority vote and moved to what they call a style and drafting committee, where they'll work on the language. It'll come back to the CRC, full CRC, for a final vote, which requires 22 of 37. Although typically, in the last few days, there have been about 32 members attending, so it's 22 out of 32. That's a pretty high burden, pretty high standard. My guess, just a guess, would be that the CRC will wrap up, and it has to finish its work by May 8th. My guess is that there'll probably be 12, 13, 14 proposals, and then some of those will be blocked or grouped together. So on the ballot, I imagine 7 or 8 or 9 actual proposals. That's typical for constitutional revision commissions that we've been doing since 1968, I guess. So that's kind of where we're at. 2 more days of floor session. As to that 39, it's made its way along, but it has been hobbled a fair amount. On its face, it's the type of thing that plays well. It's easy to stand up and say, kill the lawyers, kill the lobbyists, and we all get that, including the jokes. But at the end of the day, when something like that gets a full, hearty debate, it's recognized that there is value in people being represented, that as hardworking as the city councilmen are and as hardworking as members of the legislature are, there's only so much that they can do. And although you could make the case that we don't need lawyers in the courthouse, we have a judge, he's an elected official, he's there to mete out justice. All people need to do is really just come there and tell their story like Wapner or Judge Judy, and away you go. On its face, that sounds that has a ring of logic to it. But if you're really at the courthouse, you realize that the complexity of the process and the rules of procedure and the standards of professional ethics and all of the unique subtleties of statutory law and administrative law and case law really require, or at least are greatly facilitated by somebody who does that full time. So too in the legislative process. Can you get a member to file a bill for you or file an appropriation for you and be pro se, be unrepresented? You bet you can. Can you maybe even get that bill passed? Perhaps. But this year, there were over 3,000 bills filed, only 200 passed. There were probably upwards of 15, 20,000 different amendments, all right? We read every single one of those. Every bill, every amendment. We attend every committee meeting, every floor session, full-time, all the time. Could you do that on your own? Sure, you would. But you would end up spending more doing that yourself, probably just in travel costs, than you spend on being represented. Moreover, you'd have to, in order to be competitive with other proposals that, quite frankly, you're competing with, you would have to do that for a period of time to where you have gained a level of skill or strategery, if you will, that would put you in parity with what you'd have if you hired somebody to do it for you. So I don't stand and make a case for hiring lobbyists, but I'm just telling you that's one that's moving its way through. The League of Cities is very focused on it. It's still alive, but I think the likelihood of it ultimately getting 22 votes on for final passage is not great. It's still a risk. It's still a threat. By the way, I would argue that that type of proposal really disfavors smaller communities, by the way. If you take big communities that are very densely populated and they have a huge legislative, our delegation is 3 members. You take some places, again, in the lower East Coast where a county delegation has 20 or 25 members of the legislature, they're going to overwhelm the appropriations process, and the small communities will not likely get heard as well if they're not represented. With that, and we could walk through a myriad of bills, but I know you have limited time and many things on your agenda. Let me just take some questions.
Okay, so you spoke about some of those bills that seem to be coming back every year. With some of the legislators leaving their posts, will they still make it back in some form or fashion? Do they just get brought back because of one side or the other finds a new sponsor? Like the vacation rental, for instance, that's been coming back a couple of years now, CRA.
Yeah. I think yes and no. with vacation rental, what is driving that is less about it's less about individual legislators that are spun up about something anecdotal. That's more about some pretty big industries. Obviously, the restaurant, hotel, and lodging associations are extremely motivated to put some restrictions on the extent to which residential properties can be operated as a hotel with what they see as no regulation. On the other side, you've got some pretty big players in Airbnb and VRBO, and all of those entities are very well represented and very politically active, and that bill will continue to come back, and ultimately I believe there will be a bill that modifies the current law, which was in 2014. And it's going to require some compromise. But I think that killing this version of the bill 2 years in a row gives our positions from the local government perspective a fair amount of political capital when we sit down to the table. So the short answer is yes, that one will come back. Some of the other ones that are kind of one-offs, the tree trimming, the preemption of regulation for economic development councils and so on and so forth, I think those are going to fade away. Those were kind of more parochial to a handful of members who are no longer going to be there. Moreover, the champions for our side on most of those bills are still in the legislature. They are still there, and their seniority will be even greater. And those who are promoting those bills aren't there anymore. So I think it's getting better. Moreover, just all I'm going to say publicly is that a lot of those bills are driven by this election cycle. They're not about whether the bill passes or not. They're about whether you can stand up in front of a group of Rotarians or Kiwanis or whatever it is and say, I fought for you, or I'm against government, or whatever. That's all going to fade away on November 6th. By the way, it'll start right back up again, but we'll have a little rest.
When does the CRC meet, the entirety? Soon?
So now,
Okay.
so after they went and did what they call their road show, they took they reduced it down to 37 proposals, went out on the road and met around the state to get input on the 37 that were on the table, and then they came into full session starting on Monday. So they were Monday, yesterday, and today, and possibly Thursday, to get through all of those on a full floor majority vote to send it to a committee to be drafted up, cleaned up. And then those proposals that made it off the floor in a majority vote come back one more time to the full commission. And that will probably be, it's not scheduled yet, but it'll probably be the first week of April, maybe the second week of April. And those that remain, my guess would be dozen and a half, something like that, will get another debate and a full floor vote of 22. Each of them that receive 22 affirmative votes then go to the Secretary of State. They get put on, and then, of course, to the Supervisor of Elections, they get put on the ballot. And then for any of those proposals to pass, it requires an affirmative vote of 60% of all people voting. Interestingly, one of the debates yesterday was on a proposal by a commissioner named Belinda Kaiser, who from the Stewart area, around Stewart. And her proposal was to make that 60% of all of those voting on that proposal, which would have been an even higher standard. So, I mean, you can kind of do the math. A lot of people choose to not even vote on a particular proposal. So that would be an undervote. Under her proposal, the undervote would essentially become a no. So it would require 60% just of the people who weighed in. As it currently stands, it's 60% of everybody that votes.
That's it. That's all I have. Questions?
We appreciate you.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. We work very hard. I say it every time I come here. This is my favorite client, and I don't say that to every client.
Yeah. Well,
Yes, you do.
I think also the important thing of as you've articulated with the amendment, or this proposal 39,
Yes.
is what we have said many, many times is this continuing attack on home rule. And as we as a community, you have been a great voice for us, for all of us. You have helped us get funding for our water treatment plant to help get that going. So the things that you've been able to do for us have been tremendous. You've really navigated that water and helped navigate the political structure of the state and help put something together that would have been impossible for us to have done. And so I think that's why Howard called you the wizard. And so I think that for us to see those kinds of things come under attack is just one more
Yeah.
nail in the coffin, so to speak. And it's important for us to articulate that if that gets out to all of the community. There's going to need to be a Florida League of Cities big educational effort, as well as the Florida Association of Counties, to help people understand what's really being said. You know, some people could say, well, you're just trying to get money. But in some cases, that money is really important. We're going to have a septic to sewer conversion conversations, and we're going to be wanting, other kinds of funding for important projects. And it's going to be hard for us as an individual community, as you articulated, to be able to get that message across as a small community. And you are well plugged in to all these legislators, and so it's hard to replicate that. So I think
I appreciate you.
thank you for all that you've done.
I appreciate the compliments, and I appreciate the recognition of the work that we do together as a team, and not to beat a dead horse on something like this Proposal 39, but I remember when I was a member of the legislature, and of course when you're an elected official, you get beat up all the time for having relationships with lobbyists, and oh my gosh, you're over-influenced by lobbyists. But I'll tell you, the way that I honestly looked at it is that they were an asset to me. They were an asset in the sense that it was a single point of contact that I could reach out and grab and get information on for an entire community, which was far more efficient than my staff or me being able to call 6 or 7 different people. And I think similarly, I see a couple of my former colleagues in the back, members of the bar, and your esteemed counsel, Mr. Levin. Most judges would tell you that they would far prefer that a party in a lawsuit be represented by an attorney rather than being pro se, because it is a simplification of the process. It's much more efficient. When I was an elected legislator, I encouraged people to have somebody represent them, somebody who was there all day, every day, that if I needed to ask a question, or if I needed something done to help promote their issue, I could get a hold of that person in 10 or 15 minutes, rather than them being 358 miles away. So it is true that it really does make a difference, and it's not just about getting money. The state of Florida has an $87 billion budget, and that money is extracted from working Floridians, single moms raising 2 kids, working 2 jobs. That's precious. Those are precious dollars, and you have to figure out the right way to distribute those based upon the priorities of the state. And having each part of the state be represented by somebody who can help provide input in these committee hearings helps those decisions be better. Are there times when one lobbyist over another is perhaps more influential? I'm sure that's the case, but that's the case in the courthouse too. There are trial lawyers who win more than others, but that doesn't mean that local governments shouldn't be represented at the courthouse when they need a decision from a judge. So I appreciate you recognizing that. I think we're going to be okay on 39. It's an honor for us to represent the city of Punta Gorda. We love what we do. We like being in Tallahassee and saying, this is our home, these are our people, and hey, don't forget us. That's what we do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
To that point too, what Nancy said, that just SwiftMud alone was challenging for us. So we're not even talking about the legislature. We're talking down here SwiftMud. So you really helped us out just navigating that process alone. So it's not just one size fits all, which we say that all the time. So
Sure.
yes, I say the same thing. And we did 7 miles in that day, and I couldn't walk like for 5 days after that. But thank you for the tour. It was great, and setting up lots of meetings with, not just our people, but other people in the state as well, so that they know what we're about and what our projects are and what our city's like. So thank you very much.
Indeed, thank you, and thanks for taking the time to come up there. One quick plug. I hope you all know what a star your mayor is within the League of Cities. Her leadership within that, first of all, that organization serves you well, and it's a wonderful asset and tool for us. Helps us double our it's a force multiplier for us, and hopefully by your membership in there and you being represented and us being on their lobbying team, we're a force multiplier for them. But you have a third force multiplier, and that is your mayor, who takes the time to be an active officer and participant in that. And I wish each of you could see her when she's in those meetings with all those senators and House members. She's really got her act down well, and she is perfectly tailored for that culture and environment, and you're served well for that. One last comment I'm going to make is that at some point in the future, it would be helpful to us to schedule some meetings, different types of meetings with other particular audience members with your city manager. So if that would be, if there's an opportunity to do that, there's some things that I'd like to do, particularly on the grant side and preparing for future grants with some agency officials. If we could get Howard up there sometime. Let's do some thinking about that.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry.
Okay, next we have introduction of Board or Committee member nominees. If your name is in the running for a Board or Committee seat and you would like to introduce yourself, please come over to this podium and just take a couple minutes to let us know.
Hi, I'm Janet Watermeyer. I live at 1890 Deborah Drive, Unit 30, and you have a donations committee that it asks for someone with an art background. And as the executive director of the Visual Arts Center, we want to give back to the city, and we thought we should put my name in for consideration if it makes sense for you. So thank you for allowing me to introduce myself.
Thank you. Anybody else, Board or Committee member nominee that would like to introduce themselves? Okay, seeing that, I just want to go over a couple of things. We have 1, 2 public hearings, and then we have 4 quasi-judicial public hearings, and then we have a couple of second readings, and then the consent agenda, and then we move into regular agenda. So it's going to be, each one of these public hearings and quasi-judicial are their own separate public hearings. So it's going to be a lot of procedural stuff going on. But if some of you are here for the regular agenda items, it's going to be a little bit before we get there to those public comments. Thank you. So first, we have ZA 01-18.
Yes, and this is the first reading of an ordinance, which I'll read by title only. An ordinance of the City of Punta Gorda, Florida, amending Chapter 26 of the Punta Gorda Code, known as the Land Development Regulations, amending Article 3, Regulating Districts, Section 3.9, CC City Center District, subsection A8 and 15, permitted principal uses and structures, renaming the Tribune Woods Historic Overlay District, amending subsection F, special exceptions, paragraph 5, Tribune Woods Historic Overlay District, amending 3.14, paragraph K, renaming the Tribune Woods Historic Overlay District, amending Article 7, renaming the Tribune Woods Historic Overlay District, providing for conflict and severability, and providing an effective date.
Good morning, Lisa Hannon, zoning official. This topic was discussed at the January 3rd City Council meeting, February 22nd Historic Preservation Advisory Board, and the February 26th Planning Commission meeting. And it provides general naming for the Historic Overlay District, just to bring the 2 districts together. Planning Commission found that the renaming amendment to be consistent with the city's comprehensive plan when recommended approval, with the final name selection to be made by City Council. We did have a representative of the Historic District Homeowners Association bring in a recommendation of that the district be named the Bethel St. Mark Overlay District in recognition of the historical work of the 2 local churches.
Thank you. Questions for staff?
I guess I don't know if it's, we going to discuss this next before we, questions from staff? or-
Discuss and then we can open the public.
Oh, that's right, this is public
Yeah.
hearings, go ahead. I'll wait.
You want to wait till we
Yes.
open the public hearing? Okay. Any other questions? Okay, this is a public hearing. If you would like to speak on ZA 01-18, now would be the time. Please take this podium over here, state your name. You have 3 minutes.
While she's coming up, it might be helpful. The title of this ordinance did not identify the name that the existing ordinance is proposed to be amended to give flexibility to the city council, should they choose to come up with a different name. But for the record, as drafted, the proposal is to change it from Tribune Woods Historic Overlay District to Local Historic Overlay District.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I'm Eunice Moulton Wiley. I'm co-chair of the Historic House Owners Association, Homeowners Association. I did speak several times in reference to the need of, first, the district not to be known as Treby Wood, and that it would be a part of the historic district, basically because of the history of Punta Gorda and the number of African Americans who played a vital part in the history of that particular community or this city. We would also like to have, instead of the overlay being called East, which is for us just a stigma, so that we can continue with our history, let it reflect that Bethel and also St. Mark churches were basically the beginning or just the foundation of that community. So the overlay, my understanding, is that it would be used for the area here, just the city, but that our continued historic district, no other name, from Cooper Street all the way back to 41, just the significance of the African Americans. We are the handprint, we're the feet, and also the heart of Punta Gorda. We've contributed much, and as we move forward in the branding, it's a perfect time. So we can show not only the Bailey men, but also our Olympians, the fact that we've had one Olympian who's never noted, Sharpie Town, just to tell the history. We don't want to become invisible as we move forward because we were vital to the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else like to speak on ZA 01-18? Please take this podium over here, state your name. You have 3 minutes. Third call. Anybody else for ZA 01-18? Last call.
Move to close public hearing.
Second.
We have a motion, a second, to close the public hearing. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Carried unanimously. Discussion?
I certainly respect the wishes of the community, the homeowners association, and value the history of Punta Gorda, period. I mean, I've been very active in preserving the history of Punta Gorda myself. So what question in my mind is if this is just for code purposes, and really all we're trying to do is refer to areas of the community, even no matter which section or whatever, do we need names, or should it be just zone 1, 2, and 3? I mean, do we need to call city center? Do we need to call, the historic part that's the National Registered Historic part? Just a question from a code standpoint.
Yes.
I kind of agree with you, Nancy. I think that it's a little bit confusing. I mean, if we're talking about removing the name of Treby Woods and then we're going to put in something that's St. Mark Bethel Overlay District, I think is very confusing to people. I'm happy that everybody is uniting together and you have a unified voice for the historic district. I think it's wonderful. And I think it's very inclusive and it makes people feel like they belong. That's what the whole goal of this is. And I hate to separate it by district, by calling it, special districts, overlay districts. I understand what's trying to be accomplished. I just wish there was a better way to describe it so it doesn't, it still segments it, and I don't like that stereotype.
And I think that's why when the city attorney drafted this, for the most part, put in local as it being a little more generic and over where it could.
See, the reason, and this is, I mean, again, I agree with you, but the way they have it is that the actual building code is different in the three areas. And so that's why they have to denote it that way. And just in discussion amongst members, just for code purposes, why Bethel St. Mark was thought of as the name is because Bethel was the very first religious service in the city itself where all members of the community came together. And then his wife was not the same religion, so St. Mark was founded that way. But this is just for pretty much generic code purposes, but the three districts is something that exists because from the standpoint of code, there are three different building code designations. Like it's a more stringent over here, a little less stringent over here and over here.
And I clearly get that, and I'm all about the unity. I think it's awesome that we are totally bringing the community together, going to promote the historic value of our community, and it's going to give us, as has been pointed out, a significant edge in branding, and bringing the standards up across our whole community. So it's just that confusion, is, do we need to have a name?
But the other two already have a name. That's the thing. This will be the no names pot. We have the National Registry, we have the downtown, and we have no names. So we have to name it something, and that's just where we are.
Gary?
I think from a coding standpoint, it doesn't need a name. However, I think that communities, even when they're united, also have identities. And from a historic perspective, and from a cultural perspective or a geographical perspective, any one of a number of different criteria can lend to the name of what a particular area community is within a greater community. If you go to many cities, whether it's Chicago, my hometown, the neighborhoods all have their separate names. It's not Chicago. There's Lakeview, there's Pilsen. They're even named after companies, Pullman, because that was the area that they used to make the Pullman cars. If you go into New Orleans, there are parishes that have names, and those names may have a religious overtone. It may be because of a cultural aspect, it may be because of a geographic aspect, and even within Punta Gorda, we have PGI, and then within PGI, we have things like the bird section. Now, they're not official names, I understand that, but they are names that are readily and overtly acceptable to describe the various, Fishville is another good example. Everybody knows where Fishville is. Okay, people don't live at Fishville, they stay at Fishville, but, so I don't have a problem of having a localized neighborhood that has a slightly different flavor than the rest of the historic district having its own identity. And as a matter of fact, I think that should be encouraged. I think that we should encourage our diversity as part of our unity, because that's been some of the history of Punta Gorda, is my understanding. That we've been this little island that's been a little bit different from the surrounding histories, and this to me just kind of emphasizes that.
I guess where I'm at is where we started in the first place, that we just wanted to be able to put up the signs that say historic
Yeah,
district.
that's all this is.
Right.
So if we could somehow maybe do interpretive signage to acknowledge the St. Mark Bethel somehow and leave that out, because I just feel like in the future, we may be back in the same situation we're in right now.
Well, that question came to my mind. It was 11 years ago. One of the people who recommended this, that we change it from Tribute Woods, was recommending that we change it to Tribute Woods. So it's what will happen 10 years from now, and will there be another name that comes about?
No, well, we got off the track. It's the unification of the historic district, period.
Yes,
Simply for code purposes.
I think we can all agree on that,
But
right?
I'm saying, simply for code purposes, this is simply to replace the word east or local. It's no deeper than that. This is not anything deeper than simply on a piece of paper that says what it is. There's no branding outside of the historic district is the brand. That is the area. This is nothing more than changing the name from east because people didn't like the name east in terms of the code. That's all this is. There's no more than that. There's no public presentation of Bethel St. Mark. It doesn't exist publicly. Only historic district. This is simply for the piece of paper to have a different name than east on paper. That's it. Nothing more.
Well, if that's the case, I'm okay with local at this point, just to keep it as simplified as possible. And look at some interpretive signage, maybe, you know, to denote what was brought up here today.
I mean, ultimately, we discussed the members, I mean, it was kind of like, why call it local when it could be called something? That was all. It's not so much emotion involved, but it's simply that, just for the code, it denotes where it was because of all the houses were built around those churches, and that's all.
We need some kind of motion.
So I make a motion that we proceed with the reunification of the Historic District as the brand, and that for the purposes of code labeling purposes only, that Bethel St. Mark be the name used instead of local or east.
Second.
Are we going to have signs that say that?
No, it's
Okay.
Historic District, that's
So
it.
it's strictly in their code, that's
Strictly in the
it.
code book, nothing else.
And not signage,
No,
not, okay,
nope, none,
okay,
none at all.
okay. So we have a motion, a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Carried unanimously. So I believe when we come back for the second reading, you'll insert the name?
Yes.
Okay. Next, we have GA 03-18.
Yes, and this is the first reading of an ordinance, which I'll read by title only. An ordinance of the City of Punta Gorda, Florida, amending Chapter 6, Boats, Docks, and Waterways, Article 1, in general, Section 6-24, use of boat ramps, Punta Gorda Code, to amend regulations relating to the use of public boat ramps and to establish regulations for the use of public day docks within the City of Punta Gorda, providing for conflict and severability and providing an effective date.
Thank you.
Good morning. For the record, Mikhail Finkel, paralegal. This proposed ordinance came out of council's previous discussion regarding Gilchrist Landing and the storage of non-motorized and motorized vehicles and the issues in the park. Between your discussion and the drafting of this ordinance, we were also notified by our police department Marine Patrol that there were some issues at the Lashley Day Dock. So these new regulations would apply to both areas, and they address just the storage and overnight parking of vessels.
So that would be at both the areas, Gilchrist Landing and Lashley Park Municipal Marina Day Docks?
Correct. And it also put into place the enforcement structure of fines. The fine levels are $100 first offense, $200 second offense, and $300 for any subsequent offense.
Questions for Mikhail?
No, I have some comments, but I'll wait till after the public hearing.
Okay, this is a public hearing. If you would like to speak on GA 03-18, please take this podium over here. You have 3 minutes. Please state your name. Anybody to speak on GA 03-18?
Hi, Joe Ferris. Just to give you an idea of how I ended up where I am, when I came around to Punta Gorda, I first looked at Lashley to stay there. My air draft was 45 feet, so getting under the bridge was problematic. And then I looked at Fisherman's Village, and they didn't have any slips available. So I ended up out in the harbor and using the dinghy docks. If we want to be a community that has that is a destination for cruisers and other boaters around the area, like down in Birdstore and whatever, there has to be a safe and effective way to get to shore and back to their boats. So as far as this ordinance goes, I think that the issues that it was addressing at the time were they had real concerns, and I think a lot of them have been addressed just by me finally hearing about it. I was able to be at the last city council meeting and take what I heard back out there, and I think the complaints should, if there are any, should be much less now. I think if you look at the dinghy docks now, there's no more storage on top of the docks, and so I'm not sure that this might not be a good time to pause this particular ordinance and wait until there are alternative resources for boaters who can't. I tried to get a slip at Fisherman's Village this month, and there's nothing there. Now you can't apparently this law will also apply to Lashley, so that's not available. They're not accepting new people at Fisherman's Village, so it ends up being a burden for cruisers and boaters in the area. So I just worry that, and this ordinance as written would only affect me very minimally. I'm usually on the dock and back off within that time frame. But every once in a while, you know, if there's a 5:30 departure out of Punta Gorda, I like to be on the dock before 4, so that I'm sure if I have any problems with the car or whatever, that I'm there on time. And same on the backside of the clock, you know, if there's a mechanical or weather delay, getting back in. So there's a very small time where that window would affect me, but it would. So I just, to sum up, I think it would be a good time to pause on that and look into these alternative solutions so that people like me have alternatives. Thanks.
Thank you. Anybody else like to speak on GA 03-18? Now would be the time. Take this podium over here, state your name.
My name is Warren Thames. I'm a full-time cruiser liveaboard. I ended up north of Gilchrist and west of 41 the same way Joe did. No availability, mast height too high to get to the mooring field. It wasn't my first choice. I would prefer a mooring field. Anyway, I'm a retired jeweler. I'm a full-time resident of Punta Gorda. My wife Diane and I also maintain a full-time year-round residence on land, District 2. My comments, well, this is just for Gilchrist and Lashley because Fisherman's Village is no longer offering services to us. I have a couple of suggestions. One is, first, I agree with the proposal. I think that unfortunately, any ordinance has to be abuse-proof. People are going to abuse it. Some people will, if they can. And that's sad, but that happens. And that's how the dinghy dock got the way it was to begin with. So I agree with it. And I also appreciate the hours mentioned that give boaters an opportunity to enjoy the nightlife in Punta Gorda. That said, just a couple of issues that weren't addressed. Joe mentioned it, and for those that work, and I don't, I'm retired, but those that do work, and those that may have medical issues, which occasionally I do have, and have to stay overnight, a possible permit from the city to allow overnight dockage for just temporarily either one night